Tonight, a super secretive unit of the RCMP, called Oil and Gas Mercenaries by some First Nations leaders, will be reviewed.
Fort Smith is also home to 3 buildings with a residential school legacy, and all of them are still active in use today.
A call to tear down former residential school buildings in the NWT.
Je suis pas de mots, je suis content. Beaucoup d'émotions aujourd'hui voir un tel accueil.
And an over 4,000-kilometer snowmobile race through Quebec's traditional territory inspires reconciliation. Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. The activities of a secretive group called the Community Industry Response Group may soon be revealed. CIRG, as it's also known, is a secret arm of the RCMP, referred to by some First Nations activists as Indian fighters or oil and gas mercenaries. Now, the RCMP Civilian Review and Complaints Commission is launching a systemic investigation into the unit. A recent APTN News investigation found allegations of intimidation, torture, lying, and deceit against land defenders at various protests in BC, including in Wet'suwet'en Territory and Fairy Creek. Questions continue to arise about Vianne Timmons, currently president of Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador. A CBC article from Wednesday questions her previous claims of indigeneity based on genealogical research. In 2010, the First Nations University of Canada was in a fiscal crisis after getting its funding cut. During her time as president of the University of Regina, Timmons helped restore funding to the university. She received a 2019 Inspire Award for education for that work. Current First Nations University President Jacqueline Ottman responded to that story today.
It was the Indigenous community that saved First Nations University of Canada, and it's unfortunate that there is one person that's identified as the savior of First Nations University of Canada, which is not the case.
Timmons told the CBC that she has never claimed Indigenous identity and clarified that she has Indigenous heritage based on a distant Mi'kmaq ancestor. A call has been raised in the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly for the demolition of buildings tied to the residential school legacy. Our reporter Charlotte Moore-Jacobs takes a look at that request from Fort Smith.
The small Métis Dene and Cree community of Fort Smith in the southern part of the Northwest Territories is home to 2,200 residents. It's also a hub for historical traumas which took place in schools and college residence buildings. Paul Boucher is a residential school survivor who attended Brennett Hall and Grandin College here. Now he's a cultural educator at PWK High School. While his love and care to his students is a far cry from what he and many others had to endure, he says more healing is possible with a new school.
At Brandon Hall, I think that's where a lot of my scars come from. You know, every day I have to see that building. You know, I like to see it gone because I think there's so many students are trapped in there that they need to be released, and a lot of things that happen in there, you know, has bothered a lot of people.
Last week in the Legislative Assembly, MLA for Thabatcha, Frida Marcellos, spoke towards this legacy.
Fort Smith is also home to 3 buildings with a residential school legacy, and all of them are still active in use today.
Marcellos also cited a capital needs assessment summary on schools released in 2021, where she noted the aging physical condition of the schools as criteria for replacement.
According to that document, JBT was scheduled to be replaced in 2018, and PWK was scheduled to be replaced in 2020, but neither has happened. Despite the age and history of both schools, I do not agree with that. So I'm hoping that our government takes notice and will work with Fort Smith to replace and rebuild new schools for our community.
Joseph Burr Tyrell Elementary School opened 65 years ago as a federal Indian day school from 1959 to 1969, with students from many nearby communities attending. After that, it was purchased by the territorial government and is still an elementary school today. Grandin College was built in 1962 and was run by the Catholic Church as a residential school until 1971. The GNWT then bought and converted the space and turned it into Paul William Kaiser High School. Lastly, Brennett Hall, currently a residence for Aurora College. According to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, one student, Emma Elton, died there in 1960. APTN spoke with the South Slave Educational Division Council, who say they are in full support of demolition and replacement of all the schools in Fort Smith. For Boucher, he hopes a replacement would be guided by survivors and families.
I think open communication is important to convey, ideas that I have or others that have about, feeling a little more comfortable or at home in an institution. Our people are not the same as people from the South. We think differently, we feel different, but it has to reflect how we live up here, the way that we used to live, and what direction do we want to go in the future.
Charlotte Mort-Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
Thanks, Charlotte. We're going to step aside for a quick break now, but coming up, a first ever skidoo race crosses the finish line.
La suite, ça va être... J'espère que c'est le pardon la suite.
Welcome back. The first ever First Nations expedition has reached the finish line. This after 17 days of snowmobiling through the ancestral territories of the Atikamekw, Anishinaabe, Iu, Naskapi, and Innu nations of Quebec. A total of 4,275 kilometers of difficult terrain covered in the name of reconciliation, Joyce's principle, and murdered and missing Indigenous women. Here's a story by Shushan Bakon, translated and voiced by Lindsay Richardson.
Maniutinam simmered with excitement as the snowmobilists arrived. Several onlookers coming from far away to witness this moment, marking the end of a near supernatural journey. Rife with challenges, the cold being first and foremost. But the members of the inaugural First Nations expedition were unwavering throughout their route. Thinking of Carole Dubé's spouse, Joyce Echaquan, because Joyce's death at Joliet Hospital in September 2020 motivated the creation of this expedition.
C'est une étape que j'ai vécue. La suite, ça va être... J'espère que c'est le pardon la suite. Ça ne passe pas aussi les peines qu'on a vécues. C'est un cheminement de guérison que j'ai vécu.
The father of 7 was greeted by his children, including his youngest, Carol Jr. He was supposed to return home after 3 days with the expedition, but ended up seeing it all the way through.
J'ai pas de mots, je suis content. Beaucoup d'émotions aujourd'hui, voir un tel accueil.
Nearly everyone who crossed his path had a message for him.
Et on va mettre toujours de l'avant le principe de Joyce pour que le Québec reconnaisse le racisme systémique. OK? Là, tu viens de faire une étape, on a encore d'autres étapes à faire. C'est d'affronter le Québec. Le Québec en entier. OK?
Carole Dubé is not the only participant left changed by the experience. This is Debbie Flamand, a Atikamekw from Manawan, on the eve of the expedition's departure.
Je suis une femme qui aime beaucoup les défis, le challenge, puis aussi d'occuper le territoire.
and you can see on her face how the territories changed her, imparting lessons about courage, toughness, and the strength of a collective.
Très heureuse, je suis très contente. Oui, c'est vraiment super d'être arrivée ici à ma lieutenant. Je suis tellement contente d'avoir fini, d'avoir terminé surtout cette belle ride, cette belle expédition. Ça a été difficile, mais ça a été un très bel apprentissage pour moi.
Speaking to APTN, Flamand glows, though that might have something to do with the winter glare.
Mais c'est qui t'a bronzé de même? La neige puis le soleil.
And among this group of more than 50 participants, at least one admitted he's hesitant to go back to everyday life in the city.
Hey, Viviane!
Vincent Chatigny is not Indigenous, but his participation represents the expedition's goal of inspiring reconciliation between nations, and he too learned a lot.
Que les cris, les Nascapis sont complètement différents. Ça a vraiment cliqué. Ils m'ont comme pris sous leur aile parce que définitivement, je n'étais pas préparé au territoire et au climat. Ils m'ont vraiment aidé. Écoute, c'est des amitiés qui vont durer pour toujours. Là. Je serais mort de froid sans eux autres. Là. C'était malade. Ouais.
And after toiling for 2 years to pull it all together, expedition organizers say it's a victory overall.
C'est incroyable. Je pensais de finir avec au moins une vingtaine, une quinzaine de participants à la fin, mais non. Tout au contraire, ça a tout été des résilients, des vrais guerriers, guerrières. Là. Je suis estomaqué de ça. Je suis tellement fier de ces participants-là. Là. Je leur dois toute ma gratitude, ma reconnaissance, et à toutes les communautés qui étaient avec nous.
While they have time to rest up now, there's already murmuring about a potential second edition, which they're hoping will take off in 2025. A story by Shashan Bacon, APTN National News, Manioutenam, Quebec.
Quite a celebration. Congrats to all those who finished. We should go along for the ride in 2025. Systemic racism in the medical system, of course, is all too common for Indigenous patients. Now, a pair of University of Calgary researchers have drilled down into racial bias among Alberta physicians. For more, Daryl Stranger spoke earlier with Professor Pamela Roach.
Pamela, thank you so much for joining us here. First off, why don't we just start with what led you to initiate this research into anti-Indigenous racism amongst physicians?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that we hear lots of patient stories around anti-Indigenous racism within the healthcare system. I think one thing that happens is it's really easy for people who work within the system to try to say they don't know where it's happening or they can't see where it's happening, and they think they're not racist and their colleagues aren't racist, but these things continue to happen. So we thought, well, the best way we can try to address that is to actually ask physicians, if they have biases. So that was the driver, because I think then we can't look away from it. It highlights that people are telling us where it's happening, then we have a duty to respond to that.
So then, Pamela, which methods were used in the study to gather the information, and what was the response like as well?
Yeah, so we sent out the survey to every practicing physician in the province of Alberta. So there's about 12,000. We had about 1,100 people reply to the demographic survey. And then within that, we asked 2 explicit bias questions around anti-Indigenous bias. The first one, they were both slider questions where you would have to click onto your screen and actually slide a little bar to the left or the right. The first question asked, do you feel unfavorably or favorably towards Indigenous people? We had about 375 people answer that question. And then the second question asked, do you prefer white people or Indigenous people? And that first question around favorably or unfavorably, about 8% said they feel unfavorably towards Indigenous people, and about 25% said they prefer white people over Indigenous people.
Wow, okay, that's super interesting. So just given what you just said, Pamela, what were maybe some of the most surprising findings and comments? And further to that, why is this damaging to Indigenous patients?
Well, I think it's what was surprising, maybe perhaps we'll start there. I'm not surprised necessarily by those attitudes. They don't surprise me, I think, based on what we hear from Indigenous patients all the time. It's not surprising. I think what surprised me was the level of honesty and candor that came back. We kind of thought that if we sent these survey links through work-related email newsletters, that people might respond in the way they think is socially acceptable. But through those answers, and then also we had a comment box, and through some of the comments that were left, it was quite hurtful, to be honest, and surprising to see just the level of honesty that was coming through there. And I think part of the reason why that is so important is it really demonstrates how confident some of these physicians were in expressing their views. And so if those biases exist even before Indigenous patients walk through the door in really vulnerable times of their lives to seek help, then that will have a huge impact on patient care.
And lastly here, what should happen now going forward?
I think what this does do is it really creates a need for accountability. So we know that there's education, there's some mandatory education, there's lots of other types of education that are being developed, which are really important. But the people expressing some of these really extreme explicit biases won't necessarily be the people who are engaging in that education. So what we need to then think about is how do we hold people accountable? How do we hold the system accountable? And building some really robust, strong policies and procedures for when these things are reported and they happen, what happens next, and making sure that we're accountable to Indigenous patients to make that better.
Well, Pamela, we'll have to leave it there, but we certainly appreciate you coming on and updating us on the research, so we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Today, a global pop culture icon turned 64 years old, and as Lindsay Richardson explained, she's never looked better.
Totally hot, totally cool, totally hair Barbie.
Did you know more than 100 Barbie dolls are sold every minute? If you lined up every Barbie doll ever purchased end to end, you could circle the world more than 7 times. She's the most popular toy of all time, and she's held more than 200 different jobs since she was created in 1959.
Teacher Barbie and her students love classroom fun.
But she's also been, on several occasions, a Native American. And now some Indigenous artists out there are trying to make her over by thinking outside the box.
Like creating regalia, creating, ribbon skirts, creating something that's actually more accurate to what they have.
We'll have more on the fantastic plastic evolution of Indigenous Barbies next week on the news.
Looking forward to that. 100 Barbies sold a minute, and 50% of them are to my daughter. APTN Investigates is set to embark on a 4-part series going inside Canada's correctional system. We have a preview of part 1 and more still to come. Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. Here's a close-up of the moon from March 6th, as seen from Gatineau, Quebec. This photo was taken and submitted by Dominic Lacroix. Great picture, Dominic. Wow. What did you get to... Where did you get such a tight shot? Next time, let us know. Send your photos to share@aptn.ca for the chance to be our next photo of the day. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, +2 with snow in Halifax, 3 in Fredericton. -6 and flurries in Kuujjuaq, -4 with snow in Nain. 0 and cloudy in Montreal, cloudy and -6 for Val-d'Or. -3 with cloud in Sault Ste. Marie, snow and -3 in North Bay. -4 for Thunder Bay and Sioux Lookout. In northern Manitoba, -8 in God's Lake, 7 below in Norway House. -2 in Winnipeg, -7 with snow in Dauphin. 7 below and snow in Regina, Saskatoon and North Battleford. -9 with flurries in Meadow Lake and Buffalo Narrows. In northern Alberta, -9 with snow in Fort Chip and Fort McMurray. 7 below with snow in Edmonton, flurries and -10 in Lethbridge. +8 for Vancouver, Victoria and Tofino. -3 in Prince George, snow and -2 in Smithers. 17 below for Old Crow, -13 in snow in Whitehorse. -12 with flurries in Yellowknife, 15 below and snow in Norman Wells. -23 in Sax Harbor, 19 below for Paulatuck. -24 in Baker Lake, Chesterfield, Whale Cove, and Cambridge Bay. Minus 25 in Resolute, 22 below in Igloolik. Over to our Ottawa studio now, where Annette Francis is standing by with a preview of tonight's episode of Nation to Nation.
Coming up just after the news, we sink our teeth into the Federal Department of Natural Resources critical mineral strategy. We'll hear from Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson on what that could mean for Indigenous peoples when it comes to mining. I'll also speak to Métis Nation of Ontario President Margaret Froh. The MNO just voted to remove over 5,000 citizens off its registry. She'll explain why that happened. And we'll take a glimpse at what's happening on Parliament Hill this week in committees. Stick around for that in just a few minutes.
Thanks, Annette. Looking forward to it. APTN Investigates is returning tomorrow night with the first of a 4-part series looking into Canada's correctional system. Inside Corrections examines the systemic barriers facing Indigenous inmates across the country. APTN journalist Brittany Guillot kicks off the series with 2,180 days. The story of a Dene man who spent 5 years in solitary confinement. A warning to our viewers, the following preview contains footage that some may find disturbing.
We found terrible outcomes with respect to Indigenous people in federal corrections.
Just locked up all day. Go through a lot of mental breakdowns, suicidal thoughts, self-harming.
Overrepresented in maximum security institution. Overrepresented in structured intervention units.
Stay on the ground. Stay on the ground.
He was in segregation for 2,180 days.
They're also overrepresented in terms of suicide.
In fewer than 5% of all of the placements in the structured intervention units was the law followed consistently.
Yeah, I'm really struggling. It's just, you just don't know what to do sometimes. There's no help in there, none at all.
It's going to be an important series. You can catch the rest of APTN Investigates Inside Corrections 2,180 days tomorrow night right here following the APTN National News. And a reminder, you can catch Nation to Nation right here in less than 2 minutes' time. Looking forward to that show as well. As for this show, we're out of time, but for much more, including more on the upcoming Investigate series on corrections, you can head over to our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us. Stick around. Annette is next. Have a great night.